I'm a philosopher, so ideas are my stock in trade. Mainly philosophical ideas, and also ideas from the world of psychoanalysis and so on. When it comes to kind of talking about ideas and ideas of how ideas have progressed through history, I spent quite a lot of my kind of professional time involved in that. But when it came to the question of spirituality, I wondered if there is such a thing in spirituality as the soul, then I really wonder what use ideas would be to it. Ideas seem to me a particularly cognitive, obviously ideational set of phenomena, thoughts, and these wouldn't necessarily help us to grow or develop or mature our souls in any way. And I suppose that was the first kind of juncture at which I begin to feel a certain limitation in the notion of ideas. And I think the thought behind that was, well, ideas almost by definition aren't real. They take place in our heads. They are, by their nature, somewhat detached from reality. They have the quality of speculation. They tend to be more about the future, they're speculative in that sense, or they're about possibilities that might have happened from the past. So to that extent, ideas and reality aren't connected. And I think it would be the case that if there is such a thing as the soul, it would be much more interested in the real. So I guess this was the first thought, that ideas are somehow not connected to reality. And if I wanted to be particularly provocative about it, I'd say in that respect, ideas are actually cousins of the lie, because they are not grounded in the real. They are somehow fictional or detached from what's real. When we talk about an idea, we're not reporting on fact. We're reporting on something whose relationship to fact is somewhat tenuous. But this set of thoughts, I think, connected with another set of practices that I guess I've been involved in, because alongside my writing work and thinking work and so on, I'm involved in I guess, broadly psychotherapeutic practice that some of you may have heard of, called constellations. The idea is you're exposing hidden dynamics in groups and systems and so on. And that work can't function unless we actually turn our ideas off, because ideas get in the way. The trouble with ideas is they obscure our relationship to reality sometimes. By obscuring that relationship to reality, they inhibit our grasp of what's before us. So I'm going to give you a couple of illustrations of this by way of talking about, first of all, different ways of seeing. It seems to me there are 4 ways for us of seeing the world. The most dominant one is an ideas-based way of seeing the world, and my nickname for it is Google Glasses. You wear a pair of glasses, and up on the kind of screen in front of you come lots of bytes of information that you can use to decode the world around you. So it provides a filter. It's a little bit like going to visit monuments around the world. You'll often see tourists looking at the monument primarily through their iPhone lens or their camera lens, rather than looking at the object itself. So it's kind of a mediated environment. We're looking through a lens at the world rather than looking at the world directly. And I say this is ideas-based because what we then tend to look at the world with is an idea of it rather than the reality. I'll give you an example of this. In relationships, particularly couple relationships, what tends to make them go wrong is when each partner has an idea of the other partner rather than being able to see the reality of the other partner, and that becomes intolerable. For example, if my partner has the idea that I'm lazy, although it might be true some of the time, the fact she holds that as an idea of me all of the time becomes intolerable, and therefore she sees every action that I do through the lens of that laziness, rather than giving me a break sometimes, when in fact I haven't been lazy or I've been ill, for example. Say you run a business and there's somebody in your business or somebody you work with who you think of as a bit of a slacker. And so one day they turn up at work and they're late again, and you think, yeah, well, of course they're late again, because they're a bit of a slacker. I've got an idea about this person, and my idea of them has been confirmed through the behaviour that I've seen. What's actually happened is that this person has been helping a cyclist who's been knocked over on the street outside the office. But I don't see that, it's out of view. What I see is my idea of this person as being a bit of a slacker, and that idea is a kind of filter through which I see them, and it limits my grasp of the reality of what's going on. So we tend to see the world through our idea of it rather than through what it is. That's one way, I guess, in which ideas, or the most, perhaps a very common way at least, in which ideas get in the way of our ability to experience what could be called the phenomenological world. When we have our Google glasses on, when we see the world most of the time, we're working hermeneutically i.e. we're working interpretatively. We're trying to interpret the world around us because there's so much to see and experience. And that reduces the world into something manageable, as opposed to working phenomenologically, where we're not reducing the world to ideas and thoughts, we're just experiencing it. Because it's much harder for us as human beings, generally speaking, simply to experience the world than to interpret it. Because interpretation provides a smaller package. It bundles up the world into bites that we can then cope with and digest. But I think that's a loss. And if I talk about other ways of seeing, I think we can see some of the benefits that come once we kind of wean ourselves off this filtered, mediated, idea-based way of looking at the world. So there's kind of Google Glasses way of looking at the world, which I think is the most common, and we all do it all of the time. The second one is what could be called a much purer way of seeing the world, and it's a kind of data view. There are no interpretations whatsoever. There's a famous tool in the world of management consultancy and organization development that some of you may know called the ladder of inference, and what it says is we all need to use much less interpretation of what goes on around us and just stick to the facts. So let's just report what we see in front of us, rather than trying to add anything to it. And I'm always struck when thinking about this by an anecdote about James Joyce when he taught writing classes in Trieste in Italy, where he was living at the time. And instead of asking his students to, produce florid poetry or beautifully literary descriptions of the world or tell very embellished stories, he simply asked them to note down what was in the room. Desks, tables, glasses of water, ceiling fittings. And of course it turns out that that's very hard for people to do because our instinct is always to add more than is necessary. And the effort of seeing can be a very hard effort altogether. And yet, of course, it's the basis, really, of good noticing. And to that extent, good fact is really the origin of excellent fiction. It's a clarity of view, but one that we can only begin to get to once we lose some of our idea clutter. And that's, I think, a kind of second level in which we begin to move beyond ideas and experience the world a little more, what I would call phenomenologically or inclusively. Then I think there are two other ways of seeing which are rarer, but I think equally useful and helpful to us as human beings if we want to kind of make the most of the kind of gift of being alive and all the faculties we have. And the third mode of seeing, I use the word hazing for, that when things go hazy or slightly out of focus. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I think it happens from time to time. When you're in a conversation or you're at a party, you begin to understand the whole a little bit better precisely because you lose focus on it. Like the contours blur, things become a little bit softer, but your understanding increases. And it increases precisely because you're not seeing so much sharpness of detail. And what emerges is a kind of more impressionistic picture that allows you to feel what's going on. And again, you're shifting from an idea space to a more, even more physical space, a more chromatic space, a more deeply intuitive space that includes more of the ambient environment in which you're working or being, but doesn't turn it over into kind of sharp fact and doesn't produce ideas around it. It's a little bit like seeing things in hindsight. Sometimes you'll have been in a difficult conversation, it might have been confusing or awkward for you, and only later you suddenly can understand what was going on. It's that sense of now you get it. It's not because you understand any particular detail, but you have an awareness that was not accessible to you when you were seeing things in other modes, if you like. And again, what's important about this level of seeing, I think, is that it takes us away from an idea space into something a bit more holistic or inclusive. And the fourth way of seeing, I'll just touch on before giving a very different example, is what I would call a meta way of seeing. We'll be in a situation where we, as it were, rise above the chessboard and we see ourselves as one of the players on the chessboard itself. Most of our lives, we're just on the chessboard, effectively. And our view is obscured. It's a bit like being in a church and not being able to see through because of all the pillars in the way. But occasionally we do get the opportunity, sometimes it happens completely by chance, and it's, I think, probably quite rare, where we see ourselves as part of the scene in which we are taking part. And at that level, we are not, again, seeing ideas at all, but what we're appreciating is not only the whole, but our place in the whole. And this equips us to understand the world, again, more roundly or more broadly than we normally can. And it spares us from the anxiety of producing ideas about the world or interpreting the world. This move away from ideas began with me, first of all, in this project around spirituality here at the RSA, but then began to connect up with the work I was doing anyway in constellations and other forms of non-cognitive, non-ideational inquiry. And I began to see it mapped out particularly in kind of ordinary experiences of seeing and how different they are. If you see how you see, if you notice how you notice the world and the different qualities to it, you can understand how ideas aren't always the way in which you do see the world or have to see the world, and that the ideas-based approach of seeing the world, this hermeneutic, interpretative way, though helpful in terms of making sense of what's going on, is also somewhat limiting. And I just want to add another example or two, just to try and illustrate what is, after all, a rather abstract subject, by talking about a couple of examples of working with creativity. I mean, I'm a writer, but I also work a lot with artists and photographers, dancers, and so on, people in the creative world, to try and help them with their creativity when they get blocked and so on. Artists from all different media will come and say, I've run out of ideas. And it's as if they believe the idea is the thing that can unlock the world for them. But in my experience of working with them, in constellations and in other forms, it's not actually the idea that is the answer, it's often the idea that is the problem, because they have an idea of an idea. They have an idea that their idea is going to come and rescue them. There's going to be the big thing. If only I had the big idea, and then everything would follow. I mean, you can think about this in a political environment, if you like, a policy environment indeed. Labour at the last election, or the Conservatives at the previous election. The Conservatives were desperate for a big idea, and the big idea at the time was the big society. Labour didn't seem to be able to produce, or at least hit upon, or communicate at least, such a clear big idea. And it was the absence of a big idea, or the strain to find one, that seemed to create a lot of tension and lose energy, lose enthusiasm for people around them. So there's often this sense that the big idea is the big answer. But in the world of creativity, it seems to me that it's not an idea that matters, because an idea tends to operate, as I say, as a kind of figment or speculative frame in the mind, and has lost some contact with physical reality. And what seems to work better in the creative space is when people identify what I call the solus, S-O-L-U-S. It's solus because it suggests what's solitary and what's unique. Because what matters about tapping into creativity in this move away from ideas is that we move away from other people. There's something separating about it. We have to follow a path that is not that of anybody else. We mustn't allow our fate to become entangled with that of others. Now, it's particularly common in artists because they become very influenced by previous masters in different media. So it's hard for them to break out of that influence and establish their own voice. They suffer from what Harold Bloom, a literary critic, called the anxiety of influence. And it's almost literally like a kind of influenza. You get a cold from the past because you can't shake off the influence of people who've influenced you. And it's very important, it seems to me, that you get rid of that idea of the previous person who's influenced you, partly because it's limiting and it stops you being yourself, but partly because it is an idea. You have an idea, a kind of fantasy, essentially, of what that previous person did that you ought to be copying or following in some way. And yet what's most helpful for people in creative spaces, it seems to me, is when they wean themselves off that idea altogether and recognise how solitary the path of creativity has to be and how non-ideas based it has to be if they're going to locate what I call this solus, which I would describe as the principle of creative energy that we all have within us. But we have it within us and get distracted from it because we go looking for an idea rather than its sources in ourselves, or its source in ourselves. The solus is most clearly recognized when we think about those things which return to us again and again, the things which bug us, the things that come up in our dreams, the images we can't shake, the repeated phrases, pictures, sounds which crop up again and again in our thinking. When we go back and log the kind of deeper stuff that's coming from our unconscious without us being able to filter it, we are able to start to get at what I call the solus, which is a kind of creative principle or a creative energy within all of us. But we have to allow ourselves to become as peculiar as we all are. The peculiarity lies in the uniqueness of our dreams, our history, the attraction or appeal we have for certain images or words that are very odd to us, and we might even feel a little bit ashamed of our relationship to them, but are defining in some way. And it's only by giving ourselves over to that particular idiom that we begin to find our solus. If you think of two particularly idiomatic painters, think of Picasso, for example, or Francis Bacon, what is so compelling about those painters, I think, is precisely this, that there is an obsession with the singularity that's only theirs. Bacon will refer back to Velázquez, Picasso will refer back to Delacroix, and so on. Even though they're fully conscious of their inheritors, they're not suffering from the anxiety of influence. They've shuffled off those influences, made them their own, because they have the courage or the audacity, if you like, to embrace what's completely unique in their unconscious and what's peculiar in their unconscious. So Francis Bacon, for example, became obsessed with dentists' pictures of tooth decay. But it became a kind of creative spring for him that influenced particularly his early works and right into his late works. And that wasn't an idea of something, it was a compulsion. And a compulsion comes from a different place from an idea. A compulsion is much more visceral, it's much darker, comes from a different source in ourselves, not from an idea like, oh, I've got an idea for doing this, I've got an idea for doing that. If it is an idea, it's more like the idea has us than we have the idea. It comes to us, it overtakes us, it calls us, and we then have to submit to it. It's that way round, rather than this notion of having ideas, which is a very common kind of 21st century notion. We talk about having ideas as though we can consume them or produce them or as though we own them. Whereas in fact, the best ideas, if ideas are valuable, are those that come at us, if you like, come from within without us anticipating them. And then the final example, and I'll stop on this one, is a similar, it's a very related notion of what I call perdition. So perdition is a very old-fashioned word. It means literally being lost. But I think it marks out a similar process. When we look for ideas, it's as if we're looking for navigation in the world. We're looking for a kind of weather vane to show us where to go. And it seems to me that's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing if we want to be creative or produce new, original, exciting work. It's precisely the getting lost that seems to be the place in which we find our most innovative kind of sources, if you like. And I always think here in relation of an essay by Walter Benjamin, and he says the only way to travel is to get lost. So he'd be completely despairing of kind of modern-day travel guides, which makes you absolutely sure you never ever get lost. It's a way of mastering a place without getting lost in it, and to that extent not experiencing it, because you are following out a preordained program or itinerary rather than exposing yourself to the culture you find yourself in. Really good exploration or good adventure should be about not having the idea. It should be about being open to what's not formed as an idea in the first place, but allows you to get lost in it. And again, certainly in the work I do with artists, this seems to come up again and again. There has to be a place of real stuckness, lostness, before you can come out again. Because unless you're truly lost, unless you truly feel resourceless at some point in that process, you are not empty enough to receive. If you keep yourself topped up with ideas all the time, you never become open enough to get the sustenance you require in order to move on. You'll just end up recycling what's already in the zeitgeist. So the idea of getting stuck, getting lost, not knowing the way forward, being radically uncertain, seem to me to be an essential precondition for moving forward. But we get scared of it because we want ideas, and ideas become our signal kind of through the forest, as it were, and our way out. So there you go, some ideas on why ideas are not so great.